Got it. Got it. We have no attendees, which is not surprising. Redirecting to YouTube. Sun Valley Starbucks with coffee in hand. There isn't a peep in the condo. Perfect. Okay. We are streaming. And let me make sure that I'm speaker viewing this so that we're streaming from the right source. And come on now. There it is. All right, my man. We are expecting Monica Nixon to be joining us back here for episode 2 of Close the Distance Dawn Patrol, as we are calling this thing. And Eric and I are going to be introducing you to the STEEPLED concept for defining and inventorying the control factors from your macro environment, which is a fancy way of saying all the stuff you have no power over, which will toss you like a grain of sand on the winds of space and time, and that you'll have to figure out how to cope with somehow. That's our topic for the next several days. And we did intros yesterday, but today is about social. We're going to take the S from Steepled and talk social. So Eric, any opening remarks?
Society involves people, and so do many of the things we study. Lots of them involve people. So, changes in people, there's a lot to talk about.
That's right. I just heard my dog Aldo in the background, letting me know that my wife is coming home from dropping kids off at school. So we are here on 12/22/21. It is December 22nd of 2021. We're winding down 2021. 2021 in some ways told 2020 to hold its beer because I think we've had quite a bit of social uproar this year. And I wore this t-shirt on purpose, by the way, free to live wild, because of that. I think that is sort of my principal polarity. And oftentimes these steepled factors are described by futurists and analysts as polarities. And the polarity that's most on my mind these days is the polarity between libertarian and authoritarian. So I'll open salvo that one out there, Eric. Any thoughts on the polarities that you're interested in from a social perspective?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say this is, a multi-thousand-year experiment for all of us. That, living in groups, we tend to make more stuff and better stuff and learn more stuff together than we do completely separately alone, right? But, if you go back to the Sumerians, and definitely you get up to the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, there comes into the question, well, shouldn't there be rules to live by? And who shall enforce those? And, you and I live here in the United States of America, where our system is nominally based, in the Constitution on 3 systems that are all supposed to set off against each other. The notion of like the one person in charge, the monarchical, executive branch, president, and then the wisdom of crowds. What do we all think, guys? And that's the legislative branch, with the 538 different representatives there through 2 houses, and then the Jewish concept of the wise council, the Supreme Court. And I think America's got a really neat system of setting all of those against each other. And of course, it's a never-ending experiment. It's a never-ending struggle. And, if there are polarities, it's really, I think they revolve around human rights. I'm kind of a Rousseau, Voltaire guy in that sense. So, we have rules, but if the rule makers break the rules themselves, do they pay any cost? And if so, how much? How much do we forgive when they don't do what they say they're going to do? Because, they're the general, if you look back, 5,000-6,000 years, there needs to be some form of code of laws, Hammurabi, on up. There needs to be some way we do things. We all agree on doing them. And, we already have, informal and cultural things that revolve around rules, like mores, customs, language, holidays, and stuff like that. And then you get into when you get bureaucracy and mandarins, and bureaucrats, then you get, no, that's technically, nope, you owe me this much of that because you didn't do this thing that way. And anybody who does this gets this instead as a bonus for doing that thing. That's a little more complicated. I don't know. So if I'm going to look at the polarities today, it's not just for me, it's not just about authority, because there has to be some authority somewhere, or we call that a failed state. The question, I think, is, do the people in charge actually have to follow the rules they say they're going to, including the rules about changing the rules? And I think that's where you get authoritarianism, which has been quite ascendant, because there's a whole lot of people, especially when you concentrate wealth quite a bit, who are like, well, why do we have to, work through this very messy democratic scheme here, asking the people, the unwashed, swarthy masses. You go back to Greece, Aristotle was, they're pretty unwashed, those masses, and we should have a limited number of people that think about, that really do the hard thinking. And there's parts of that are element, they're an element in every liberal society, small L liberal, which of course comes from the Latin free person. And I think that's how the founding fathers saw liberalism, was that, you're free until we need a rule to put in over you. And, I think the big polarities these days are between systems and rulers, would-be rulers, and people who adhere to certain ideologies, who believe that we need a strong, centralized authority for damn near everything, and whenever they change and decide something needs to change, it doesn't have to make sense to the rest of us. They can just do whatever they want. And then there are people who believe that you're free first, and then rules come in after that. And as a rule maker, you're just as accountable as everybody else. In fact, maybe more so. Maybe you need to be a servant leader. And just because you're making decisions for policies doesn't mean you should be indemnified from the harm that you cause. And,
right.
You too can be held accountable.
So there's a social contract in our government that suggests that public servants, I use those words very intentionally, public servants are there to serve the public and not the other way around. The citizenry, actually, to be very, very specific in terms of the constitutional nature of what you agreed to at your birth, if you were born here in the United States, where we're coming from. By the way, and for those of you watching from outside the United States, you all have your own social contracts that are not dissimilar, probably, from what we have. I have plans, by the way, for some special guests to be joining us in the weeks ahead. I'd like to do a series on the People's Republic of China and take a look at the control factors that are really in contingency for China, and looking at China's existing domestic social contract, and then how that is projected as a power dynamic into the spheres of influence geopolitically. And I know you'll have a lot of fun with that, as will I. I'll get a co-conspirator on here too that can give us that Chinese perspective from someone who's grown up in that culture. And by the way, if anybody would like to be a guest analyst on this little show that we're starting, just reach out. And the way to reach out, and I'll be very precise about this, the way to reach out is through our shiny new Discord server, which I created yesterday. And here it is. You should see it on your screen. I will drop into the chat the specific link, but I'll speak it out loud here for you. And that is core.vc/openrecon-discord. And let me try and find my chat window here again, because I've seemed to have misplaced it. Oh, I know why. It's on a different screen. Yeah, so it's core.vc/openrecon-discord. And if you'd like to register for this series that we're doing here, you can use core.vc/CTD2022. core.vc/CTD2022. So having put this up just in the last 24 hours, Eric, I know you're not on there yet. Neither's Monica or anybody actually, except for my son Liam and his friend Forrest, who are my growth hacker team from the last couple of years. Those boys have now gone off to college, so to speak, and they're home for Christmas break. So they were the two who picked up my gauntlet on the Discord side of things. But Discord will be really where we start to talk about some of these topics and topic ideas. We'll be threading that back into the openrecon.com web platform where this will exist in the Web 2.0 world. And then we're going to be stitching together the OpenRecon Web 2 to the OpenRecon Web 3, the decentralized ledger that we will be talking about some of this stuff on in perpetuity because of its nature as a less controllable phenomenon. We'll get into technology tomorrow when we reconnect. But that is really all I had to say about Discord. Eric, any remarks?
None.
All right. So one of the things that I mentioned here a second ago was, and I'll stop the stream, join the Discord, that's your final call to action, was the notion of liberté. And then I think the French really had a twin notion of égalité, which isn't equality, it's fairness. The notion that fairness and the treatment of a people under the social contract should be fair, equitable, so to speak. And I think a lot of people have been redefining the notion of equity as the equality of outcome rather than the equality of opportunity. So I'll throw that out as a skewer. Any thoughts on égalité?
Well, as a French linguist, as my main language pair, I think a lot of the égalité, égal, and équitable, equitable. I think a lot of the concepts line up pretty straight with English. A lot, not all do. It should be said that when they went ahead to try and, when they first launched liberté, égalité, fraternité, got to have the siblinghood, brotherhood, neighbor concept in there. That one of the first things they did with it was mass murder. And then then got an empire and then returned to the monarchy. So, for those who get, caught up in ideologies, it's just a good word of caution that, the purity that may exist in your mind may be adulterated very quickly by humanity. And yet that's how you get on the road here. You got to start somewhere. And, cause it's pretty easy to remain in, monarchical or, autocratic terms, but, basically democracy's hard. It involves a lot of people, it involves smart people who think they're smart, dumb people who don't know they're dumb, people who may look dumb to some, who ain't as dumb as all that. And, it's a noisy conversation. And, I think this very, this very concept it may seem esoteric, but I agree with you as a launching point here. If we get into the development of technology or economic policy or things of that nature, and if we think of ourselves as a crisis point, which a lot of people do right now, because, well, it's things have been very tense. You've got some nations closer to going to war than they have been in a long time. You have some very controversial leaders and controversial ideas around the world. So some people think that, this is a real crisis point, and I believe quite a bit of that. So if that's the case, then what's the opportunity from this crisis? Are we picking an A-B road here? Are we going to get closer to something or further away from something? If so, what is it? Personally, I think a lot of this is driven by technology. and that we are close to being able to verify certain types of information, and keep massive records of extreme fine detail that really make bullshitting a lot harder than it used to be. I think a lot of certainly anybody who's ever been in a close romantic relationship for a long time knows that there's a certain amount of fuzziness and truth that can smooth social interaction, right? Certainly, what is termed the little white lies are that which make the social grease for a lot of situations. However, we're been fomenting technologies if you think of mobile devices and the internet, where we are tracked, whether we intended to set up a panopticon on ourselves or not. Some of the authoritarians were like, yeah, absolutely, we want to control people and we want that record. And then you have libertarians who say, I don't want to be tracked or controlled, but the technologies that we've created don't tend to lend in that direction. We've gotten really good at information technologies and shrinking their size, increasing their power, lowering their electrical demands, and all sorts of other trends. So basically, everything you do, the condition of your body, everything you purchase, that's all coming under a microscope, and the ability to keep a record of that's, that doesn't degrade, and can be amassed by multiple parties and copied and transferred. That's the consequences of Moore's law, of that computing power just going up and up and up and up on the hyperbolic curve. There is, well, yeah, okay, great. Now we can damn near keep track of every event in nature. Now what? And I think one of the things that we're facing is the fact that some of our comfortable mythologies may be belied by the fact that we can or should be keeping a record of things. And there are some people that have been, some government institutions, for example, especially on the local level. Hell, I'm going to start throwing some elbows already. I live in Missouri, and in the St. Louis area, there's a rich cottage industry here in having government structures that don't actually keep records. That may be required to by federal and state law, but still don't. And, before it's like, oh, sorry, that's on paper. Or, well, we have records, so give us 6 weeks and we'll send you a summary of those things. And 20 years ago, this government's far too small to keep track of that kind of thing. Because St. Louis, for example, set up into 97 different little chunks in the county, and then there's the city, and it's like, oh, well, if we had to keep track of every single speeding ticket we wrote and how much cash we took in to pay that off and who our contractors were on various projects, that'd be just so much. We're entering a phase, though, with technology where those transactions are very easy to keep track of.
Yeah.
And so, let's say you come to those governments and go, hey, how would you like to do this? And then this will output. And hell, you could keep that updated real time. And then you watch people go, we have a bit of a scandal here where we lose about 1,000 foster kids a year out of the state foster system. And turns out people aren't keeping a record of that. It's like, really? You're not keeping a record of lost children? And that, has flown in the face of a Health and Human Services report from the federal government that says many, many of those kids are at risk for being sex trafficked. And then you look back at the government and go, are we really not keeping records of that? Because actually here, check out the law, you're supposed to. And, where does that story lead? I'm not exactly certain, but before there particularly technology behind the curve, 10, 20, 30 years, these are things that could escape our attention. No doubt a great shame, no doubt a great tragedy in many cases. But you could go, oh, we'd love to keep track of that, but just we don't have the manpower. We don't have. God, how would we do that? It's like, well, does the kid have a cell phone? Is this a 16-year-old? Did they run away or did they run to another family member? They got a cell phone? Facebook knows where they are. How come you don't? You've got a legal remit from our state. We've decided as a society that, yeah, you can, this kid's parents are not there and she needs something else. So we've said, yeah, we're going to give legal right of the state to pick up the slack and provide parenting type services to this child. I mean, I can't just walk into your house and take your kids, right? That would be illegal, right?
Yep.
Yours are easy to manage. I mean, they're already basically raised. But I can't go up and down the neighborhood here and just start raising kids. It's a legal thing. We give you the remit for that through legislation, and we've done that. And they're like, oh yeah, well we're not keeping track of that. It's like I can give you five different companies that probably know exactly where that kid is right now. One or two of them might be Chinese, one might be Israeli, given the state of spyware. But how come y'all don't have it? And so, as the technology advances here, your ability to say, oh, well, sorry, we just couldn't keep track of that thing is like, that becomes less credible over time. It's like, really? Now you might have to ask, why are you so comfortable losing kids out of your foster care system? And then if you start reading about how some of the money that is produced from some of the services forced out of these kids once they're out of the foster system, some of that money makes it back into the pockets of local officials and law enforcement officers. Is like, oh, well, now we have a real conundrum here. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that. Now, in this case, this is a recent thing I've been involved in here in Missouri. I testified on this about like 6th or 8th of October of this year. 3 weeks later, the building that contained all the records for the children's division burned to the ground.
Wow.
I mean, correlation, not causation. I can tell you that in terms of time, it was correlated. I started asking, and I came and testified before the legislature, and I had one message: keep records. That's it. Yeah. But it's kind of subversive because I know that once you start, once you take away that gauzy, oh, well, we have so many, there's events where kids, very passive voice, well, some kids are on run events and they age out of the system. I was like, that's a fancy way. Now in Vermont, where I'm from, we go, you lost them. You don't know where they are and they're kids, and you lost some kids. Hate to, be so stark, but I am still from Vermont. And as soon as we put that in stark terms, like, y'all are losing 1,000 kids a year, and you're not keeping track of records. How about you keep track of records? 3 weeks after that, all the records burned down.
Maybe one of the action items coming out of this, and remember, intelligence is about action. Maybe one of the action items that comes out of this is we could hand the state of Missouri a design for a distributed ledger that would fulfill those responsibilities and do so while maintaining the privacy and of those involved.
Absolutely.
Someone will. Why not us? And it's a choice. It's a choice-making process. Winning is a choice. And by the way, I want to recognize Monica. Welcome, Monica. Glad you're here.
Sitting in my Lexus, so I didn't wake everybody up.
No worries. No worries at all. Well, enjoy your coffee, and we'll get you into this conversation here in a second. We're talking steepled social. And I started us off about half an hour ago talking about the polarities between authoritarian and libertarian. Mr. Garland jumped us into a government angle and the social contract, and we've been kind of using some examples around that. One thing I wanted to share back was one of the things I discovered, and I've led such a sheltered life, I've never heard of this concept until this past year. But Václav Havel, the former Czech, what was he, prime minister at some point? But the notion of a parallel society or parallel polis is something that's very, very curious to me. And by the way, I got a degree in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it only taught me one thing, and that's that politics makes us dumb. So as we're thinking about social forces and how social structures ultimately are expressed through political, governmental, and then eventually we'll get into legal, ethical, and how those control factors are ultimately managed. I wanted to share this idea of the parallel society or parallel polis because I think that's what's happening right now. I believe that because of the weakness of our national currency, I won't say weakness, I'll say frailty, the vulnerability of our national currency, there has sprung up alternative ways of remuneration, of transacting that is going far beyond barter systems. I think there are symbolic stores of value that people are migrating to, which will forever change how the Americans are governed. I don't know about the rest of the world, but I will say that it scares the living crap out of the Politburo in the People's Republic of China, and a few years ago is what is ultimately driving the notion of a social credit score and the ostracization of those who are out of line, out of compliance. I think we're going to see some sort of attempt at that elsewhere in the world. And I speak these words on December 22nd, 2021, when I've just heard that the Austrian government is now sending people into the streets to hunt down the unvaccinated. So with that little bit of an aside, Monica, you're all caught up. Welcome. Tell me about your perspective on the social control factors that none of us really control, but we all have to live and cope with.
Well, I haven't had coffee yet, so you might have to give me a few moments for my brain to jolt in. You guys just said a mouthful about what's going on in our world. But the idea, like you said, of alternative currency systems and, well, as you guys well know, there's obviously, speaking of control, who wants to control this, right? And you can see the JP Morgans of the world and all these, these other banks and this, that, and the next thing that I'm intimately familiar with. Well, they would certainly like to have control of it too. Make no mistake. The very notion that the central banks of the world would allow something that they can't control is an interesting concept, let's say, and how all that's going to play out, because it ultimately is about power. And if you look at, the impetus on the other side really is to make sure, and yeah, Eric Johnson, I know you're well aware of this, to be able to, if you look at what they've announced, for example, with the IRS recently, monitoring everybody's accounts, the suggestion, which I don't suppose is so much of a suggestion, it probably will become a reality. Not sure where the IRS is going to get the resources, but it all plays out very interestingly, because if they ever could have full control and everything was completely digital, I mean, they would be able to tax you at will, shut you down with, if you dissented from certain things. Essentially, I mean, impose negative interest rates, right? So that's a very interesting thing that's going on in the backdrop. I mean, we all work our whole lives, right, for money, some form of currency, if you will. To think about some of these guys who, well, we've already seen what Wall Street's capable of innumerable times. Thinking about the banking class having that kind of power mortifies me. I'll just say that.
Mm. Amen.
Well, I would say, that as you creep forward in any amount of power, whether it's telecommunications or kinetic, and by kinetic I mean blowing stuff up, every time you take a leap ahead, there is a big struggle between there's a big struggle between the authoritarian worldview and the libertarian worldview. You could say World War I and II, particularly World War II, when you consider the role of propaganda in both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. They were using technologies to control populations and attempt to establish a new form of much stronger state government there. And I think a lot of that was motivated by the fact that the power was there. You
look at the tools. Look at the tools they have now for doing that. I mean, the rise of social media, the surveillance state, this, that, and the next thing. Edward Bernays couldn't have
Well, I think Edward Bernays could. For those of you who don't know Edward Bernays, he was the father of public relations and Sigmund Freud's nephew, I think. And he feared the madness of crowds, and he thought that the crowds needed to be controlled as much as possible through that kind of propaganda. And yeah, now we're in a place where we hand whoever, because we don't know who's behind a lot of the technologies we use. We're lucky in a sense that following the 2016 election, we found out just how sophisticated the tools were with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and Instagram and other tools to target very specific, voter profiles, either convince them not to vote, in some criminal cases, lie to them about where voting is, or just inflame their emotions. There's more precision to that than we've ever had before that we're aware of. And some of the stuff about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica coming out post Trump's election, because people are like, how did Midwesterners and Southerners end up falling in love with a mobster from Queens, New York? How'd that happen? It seems so weird. We now went looking for it. And the Cambridge Analytica Facebook question's interesting, but if you talk to pros and you start digging deeper, you think Facebook's got something? Look at Oracle. What do you think their internal tools are like when they run the back end of so many databases? And now they're of course going for health records and in kind of interesting ways. But the conveniences that that we have demanded because they're available. Let's say Alexa, Siri, Amazon Prime, streaming television. I mean, a lot of these things are fun and useful and easy, and the people who own those assets get to collect massive amounts of data on us. I think people of our age and generation are a bit different about thinking about these things than when I talk to members of the millennials or Gen Z, even, because they're just like, yeah, we got it. Y'all gonna know everything about us. Like, yep. So I got it. I've been surveilled since I was a toddler, digitally. When some of us who grew up in the 70s, like, these things were not possible. There was, propaganda and crowd control, but there was not. I have an iPhone here. It's like, this is my very own FBI warrant, FISA warrant, Stasi, East German secret police. In my pocket that I. What's that?
Monitoring device.
Yeah, I mean, and if you get a little watch, then you've got a kinetic, that connection with that tech company goes all the way to your physical body, and and people are not, in America, people are not being forced into this. North Korea, different deal. Xinjiang province in China, different deal. But here we're all agreeing to this. But we agreed to hand this information over about ourselves to people who might be at a much more centralized hub of power and may be able to make choices about that power, not very encumbered by current laws or sufficient regulation. We gave our consent to the conveniences before we understood the consequences of giving that power to people. So,
I know both of you at some point in the not too distant past have actually read the EULA, which accompanies the systems that you use. I'll confess to not reading them all, but it's pretty shocking if you actually read them. So those of you who don't read your end user license agreement with whatever software or devices you do use, I suggest you start because you'll get a picture of what is actually being collected about you. The amount of telemetry that the average American produces each day, I think, would be a shocking figure should we be able to find that. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, which is where I'm going with the parallel polis. I think there is a parallel society which is emerging, decamped from the official society. And that's not a bad thing, by the way. It's how liberty maintains itself historically. And by the way, I also got a history degree, and we are, I think, today at the end of the long-term debt cycle that really started with Bretton Woods. Now, if you accept that from an economic structural point of view, these things last about 75 or 80 years or so. That's right about now. The inevitable next step is detailed in a book called The Fourth Turning, and the notion of the cyclicality of time and trends, particularly social trends. I'm super looking forward to exploring more specifically how those social trends that the landscapes that we analyze and will analyze going forward on this program will reveal themselves, and then the stakeholders and the issues ultimately that those stakeholders are passionate about and care about. And I think we're gonna find some interesting ways that the social contingency factors that we're all forced to cope with are a little more manipulable than we thought. And speaking as someone who I actually looked at off-grid property in the last 6 months or so, I think I could get away. I think I could find a place that is far enough off the grid that I might have privacy again. But that's speaking as someone who, owns a business and has means and stuff. I don't think your average American is going to be able to find that same retreat to retreat to. Monica.
Oh, Whitefish, Montana, my friend. Whitefish, Montana.
There you go.
It's gotten very expensive. Idaho as well is still very nice, but please don't tell everyone. We've seen a lot of people with your mentality coming into here. I mean, we all know what Idaho is, where I'm sitting right now. But 2 points on what you were saying before that kind of popped into my mind to further this conversation and add another layer of depth. The notion of post-truth in the midst of all this, that you've got this nexus of FANG-type companies that control this data aggregation and those types of tools like we have touched on a little bit. And I actually work for a precursor startup to Cambridge Analytica. So I have a pretty good idea what some of those tools can do, and it's horrifying, and I'm sure we'll have some more conversations about that. But you couple that with the existence of those tools and the notion of post-truth. I think we've all heard that, right, guys? Right. A post-truth society.
I itch every time I hear it, but yes.
Yep. Okay. And one of Garland, I know you and I have talked about this. Kellyanne Conway was one of the first ones to come out and really put this out there in full view with the notion of, well, what do you mean? We're just going to present our alternative facts. And everybody went, what?
Yeah, hold on that one. I came out with my thread. It's time for some game theory about Russian interference, and I started talking about the right-wing media. I said, you no longer have an alternative opinion. You now have alternate facts. 6 weeks later, Kellyanne Conway whipped that on CNN about how many people were at Trump's election. I was like, I want royalties, or for you to go to prison, one or the other. But
well, the other thing that comes to mind in the midst of all this that I had a thought of as I was listening to you two dialogue is also the war for all this data and whether it can be collected. GDPR, for example, in the European Union, direct oppositional approach to what happens here. If you want to talk about GDPR, I'm pretty expert in GDPR, versus the power that the advertising industry, nonetheless, the corporations and so forth, can exert stateside is wildly different than what's happening over there. You see some of the states in the United States, California has a privacy law. There's a few other states that have also kicked in some various different protections and provisions around your data and how it might be utilized, gathered, but nothing like, and it's not just Europe. Some other countries, and I do have lists and some research, and I can walk you through how they're implementing some of their privacy laws. But there's a war for all that information underneath all this as well, and the value and the monetization of it. So, yeah. So I think about those intersections as well as far as the social contract and what Eric was saying, this notion of, our generation certainly not being so amenable to constant surveillance, and the millennial generation seemingly being just fine with it. I'll probably let Eric Johnson comment on that, of what happens when you lose certain liberties and freedoms.
Yeah.
Because with that surveillance, right, you don't have that liberty you thought. I've heard people even my age, a woman who actually I used to work with at Hewlett Packard many years ago, very bright actually, and she said, "Well, Monica, what do I care? I'm not doing anything wrong." That's exactly the wrong point of view. Exactly what gives them the right to monitor your sleep cycles. Push all this stuff you're doing.
Anyone who takes the position that you have nothing to fear if you're doing nothing wrong has surrendered the old social contract by default to an expectation of authoritarianism. There's no other word for it. And that's back to that polarity. I will retain my liberty, I'll say, to death. That's the social contract that I accepted when I stayed in the United States and didn't go somewhere else, frankly. I think it's the default acceptance, and we call it a constitution, that you sign on to when you come into this jurisdiction. And under that jurisdiction, the social contract is a limit on government. It's not that you're not giving government, rights. You're keeping government at bay. And, one of the topics that I want us to linger on in this show as it evolves is the notion of the monopoly on violence. The definition, I forget who coined that phrase, but you guys probably know better than I do. But the notion that government has a monopoly on violence, that is no longer necessarily the reality of this. When non-state actors can, in fact, do tremendous reputational harm to you personally. And, I won't mention any specific examples, but let's just say non-state actors do tremendous harm to individuals and to organizations that are opposed to their interests. And that's part of the social contract that you're agreeing to when you say words like greater good. We have to do this for the greater good. Those are Marx. That's Karl Marx. And the notion that, by the way, Karl Marx was the worst Marxist in the universe. And we'll get into some of that from a historical perspective too. But I think that's really the bottom line socially, is as we think about the society, the civilization that we want to live in, do we want to live in a civilization where you surrender your expectations of privacy at the door when you cross the border, so to speak, and that there is that future?
Well, to jump in on that with the, first of all, the notion that, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, then you don't have to worry about surveillance. That assumes that the definition of wrong doesn't change.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, because somebody doesn't decide that it's retroactive, but you used to do this, that characterizes you this way. So, perhaps that's a reckless way to view your own freedom and your own privacy. Right. As far as the monopoly on violence, that's part of the theory of what defines a nation state, which is borders, culture, usually a group mythology of how that nation came to be, and that the government has a monopoly on violence. It's not to say that nobody else can commit violent acts, but that there are consequences. That the only people that are allowed to constrain somebody's freedom and not have it called kidnapping are law enforcement. And that if anybody comes into your nation state territory and starts doing violence on citizens in if they do it on an individual basis, it's a criminal act from a foreigner. And if it's in an organized thing, it's called war. And any place where that monopoly on violence breaks down is considered a failed state. So Somalia, if it's just when that broke apart and it was just a bunch of warlords, we called that a failed state. You can have a place where the government are, to use the technical term, a bunch of assholes and, use violence indiscriminately on their own citizenry. North Korea comes to mind. But they still have a monopoly on it. It's not a failed state. It's just a, very unpleasant one for everybody. But what's interesting about the cyber world here, and talking about the greater good and where all of that is getting mixed, and I think that's where you had some people who were truly the globalists, even though that's a Steve Bannon construct. I thought he was projecting away from the reality of he's really one of the globalists. There are people who were like, these nation-state borders are getting very porous, and our interests are really global, and our money is global, and our supply chain is global. So we, odd that you mentioned Marx. His key insight is that when people get to a certain concentration of wealth, they have more in common with other people in other nations that have that concentration of wealth than they do with their own people. I think that observation still sticks around. As you can see, when you find out Kim Jong-un went to boarding school in Switzerland and his English is great, and he was there. I know this because he went with a friend of mine. And apparently he's quite a pleasant gentleman and whatnot, and just belongs to a murderous regime. You can't pick your family.
Exactly.
But as far as the social impact of globalization, that we're like, oh yay, cheap materials from places where their labor protections aren't as good. Yay, that'll be great for profit and manufacturing. What happens when you get like these cyber technologies and, we find out, for example, that there are foreign countries that are like, okay, we're not going to do violence against you, physically, because you would get really pissed off at that. What if we just send you a bunch of fentanyl? The precursor chemicals of that being made in Wuhan, China. How about we send you bricks of that big enough that it'll kill Ohio, literally, in one shot, if you don't catch it? What if we have we have an application called TikTok, which is, creates some very, very entertaining videos from creative human beings, and also is a keylogger and sucks everything off your devices and the entire hard drive. So just uninstall that right now, please. Thanks. And they proliferate. They proliferate a trend of breaking stuff in this, bashing stuff in at your school. So there was a trend encouraging kids to video breaking equipment at their school. Well, that metastasized to the last week we had, it was shoot up your school day. Yeah. And there were people I know who kept their kids home. Well, let's say there were folks that did, let's say that had worked in 150 different schools, right? And let's say we tracked that to a nation state intelligence service that was behind the coding of that and the timing of that and whatnot. We've kind of lost the monopoly on violence as a state there. And, then you got to go, well, wait a minute, who the hell let this company in, into our phone systems? But wait a minute, the violence was perpetrated by American citizens. Well, it's, that's the new world that we're on. That's the bleeding edge that we're standing on right now, is that, there are ways to damage nations. The Russians and the Chinese are fully on board with this, and hybrid warfare of we don't have to deploy an aircraft carrier to create kinetic harm in your country. Now, this is a problem, as we've caught them doing that, and we're quite aware of that. It's like, well, if you don't mind, we do have aircraft carriers, and we have missiles that go Mach 12 now, if you don't mind. So if you could cut it out, that'd be great. But that's more of an orthodox view towards nation state geopolitical balance and war. And I think no matter what happens with the diplomatic and other consequences that we impose on nations that want to harm our citizens in an organized army-like fashion, or in a subversive TikTok trend fashion. We still have to ask what the future of the nation state is here, and what is the greater good. When these technologies have opened up these borders to us, and that can go in a direction of us seeing each other more compassionately, or it can lead us to try and get our 12-year-olds to smash the soap dispenser in the bathroom. What direction are we going to go with those technologies?
I'd like to share something with you. You prompted something that I hope we can explore in the months ahead. And to your point, Colonels Chow and Wang, February of 1999.
Oh, unrestricted warfare! Yeah! Oh yeah, the classic.
Called Unrestricted Warfare.
Uh-huh.
161 of this translation in the chapter 10,000 methods combined as one.
Uh-huh.
Supra-domain combinations beyond the domain of the battlefield. I'm just going to read for a minute or so here. Domain is a concept derived from the concept of territory and used to delineate the scope of human activities. Seen in this sense, a domain of warfare is a demarcation of the scope of what is encompassed by warfare. As with the concept of supranational combinations, the idea of supra-domain combinations, which we propose, which is also a shortened form. To be precise, so they're well into their argument. They're 160 pages into their argument at this point, and they're making recommendations on how China will defeat American hegemony in the 21st century. So that's the context of this argument. To be precise, these terms should be followed with the words of actions in warfare if we are to convey in full the intent of these concepts which we are constructing and employing. This is to make clear the point that views about supra ... combinations driven by beyond limits thinking are confined to the scope of warfare and its related actions. What these colonels are arguing is we can't beat the United States on the battlefield. There's no way we can topple American military hegemony. We have to go beyond those limits. We have to be unrestricted in our conduct of warfare. The concept of supra-domain combinations lies between the previously discussed concept of supranational combinations and the concept of supra-means combinations, which will be explained below. And I'll end with this. As with its placement in our discussion, the concept of supra-domain combinations is an indispensable link in the groundbreaking line of thought about going beyond limits. Just as aircraft had to break the sound barrier before they could fly at supersonic speeds, those who are engaged in warfare must break out of the confines of domains if they are able to enter a state of freedom in thinking about warfare itself. Breaking the boundaries of ideology is a prerequisite for breaking the boundaries of action. And then they go on to talk about how you could poison a society with opioids and control that society through neurochemistry. Which, by the way, has been a hobby of mine since the pandemic lockdowns began 19 or 20 months ago or so. The notion that you are intentionally attempting to raise my cortisol level so that I can ameliorate that cortisol through dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, all of the neurotransmitters that restore me to a state of well-being and a feeling of homeostasis. So that's really what's happening socially, everybody, is we are being programmed because we've made ourselves programmable through the API of this. And that's where we better leave it, guys. Final word, I'm going to give you guys the final word on all of that. And then I think we better take it home on social, and we'll come back tomorrow with technological.
I'd just like to say that the Chinese should have kept that inside voices, kids, and not followed up with it. Because, like, hey, they called their shot. They did it. It's been 22 years. It's like, so you guys, that subtitle could have been, hey, we remember the Opium War, and you look enough like the British, we'll do you too. Like,
exactly.
So,
yep.
Yeah. But what is it? F around and find out? Was that what the kids say? We're in the find out phase of that strategy.
Amen. Monica.
Well, that last part was I've had that exact same thought as you have. It's kind of hard to miss that in all of this. And I'm with what Eric said right there as well, that we are in the wait and see how this whole thing plays out phase. And hopefully there's more people who think like us than the people who are willing to concede to be constantly surveilled, have their bodily autonomy violated, and to be manipulated, that don't quite yet understand how all these things, I guess, coalesce, maybe the degree to which people with intelligence-related backgrounds like us do.
Very well said, both of you. We are here to think the unthinkable and to welcome you into this void. I had a conversation actually taking my youngest to school just before we started this conversation. And I said, Xander, courage is looking into the void. And Nietzsche would tell you that until the void stares back. But bravery is continuing to look until the void blinks. So we're going to have a stare down contest with the void, you fellow provocateurs. And I love how we're off on the right foot here. 60 minutes of, great stuff. And Monica, so glad you were able to join us as well here partway through.
Well, I apologize for my lateness. I just did not, everyone else in my condo was asleep, and I'm trying to go, how am I going to rig up video and turn all the lights on and do all this? So I finally went to my car. I'm on vacation and wasn't exactly as prepared as I should have been for all of this, but it's been very enlightening, and yeah, wow.
You're a superlative analyst and a really good human being. So
thanks. Thank you, Garland. I feel the same about both of you, and I appreciate being included in your conversations here. You're both very brilliant people, in my opinion, and I hope that our world kind of goes a little bit back to how it used to be. Like Eric said, I don't think I want to live in the world that some of these people seem to be talking about.
Amen, sister. With that, thank you all for closing the distance here with us today. Dawn Patrol is ended. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm going to assume you guys are good for tomorrow? Same time, same bat channel?
There's Dawn. I'll patrol.
All right. Monica, you
I need to find out if Ross has scheduled for us to go skiing tomorrow morning up on the hill. If he has, I will be out.
You will be missed, but we will be thinking of you sledding down those slopes of Sun Valley and enjoying your vacation. I understand this is awkward timing to start an initiative like this, but I think I shared with you guys.
I understand why you did. Yes.
Right on.
We've got 4 feet of snow here. It's pretty wonderful, and it's coming down very seriously right now. So,
well, you go get some powder.
I think I might.
And we will be here tomorrow, same bat channel, same bat time, and our steepled contingency control factor for tomorrow will be technology. So I do hope you can join for that one, Monica.
That's probably one that I should not miss. So yeah, I think I probably should push the skiing out, because this one is where I have some subject matter expertise.
I'll shoot you a wake-up call.
You might do that. Dial me 50 minutes before. Are you awake?
Get your coffee, Monica. Buckle up.
Get going. Buckle up. I know. Yes,
all right,
I was still asleep. Okay. Take care.